Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Lords are either heroes of the people, resisting the worst excesses of the government, as a second chamber should, or they're oversized and unelected and trying to thwart the democratic will of the nation. It's not the first time we've heard the argument, but it turns out the radical left is on the side of the Lords tonight, the Conservative right in uproar. What the Lords voted to do was force a delay on the government's plans to cut tax credits. It was a stance of arguable constitutional propriety, but it appears to have done its job.
I believe we can achieve the same goal of reforming tax credits, saving the money we need to save to secure our economy, while at the same time helping in the transition. That is what I intend to do at the autumn statement. I'm determined to deliver that lower welfare, higher wage economy that we were elected to deliver and the British people want to see.
The Chancellor conceding this evening that mitigating measures will be taken in his autumn statement. Well, with me, our political editor Allegra Stratton and our economics correspondent Duncan Weldon. Evening to you both. Fairly amazing day. Allegra, George Osborne was having a very good parliament. He was having a good run. Suddenly there's a U-turn.
This is the biggest U-turn he's ever had to make, and he's been in this post for coming on for 6 years. And I'd say he's wounded on quite a number of levels this evening. He is personally, politically wounded. A week ago on our programme, me and you, people were telling me that they were adamant they wouldn't be shifting. Fair enough, over the weekend they sent out some of their heavy hitters to say on TV programmes they would be shifting, but it didn't seem to convince the Lords. So he's personally, politically wounded. He's strategically fairly wounded because he had this ruse that he'd get it through both houses of Parliament through a statutory instrument, as Lords said this evening, not so fast. Economically, big problem, isn't it, Duncan? Because this is a £4.4 billion saving. If he is softening it in any way, we're looking at billions of pounds that he's got to find more of in the autumn statement, which is in a month. And also, lastly, his rebrand is weakened. He's supposed to be repositioning the Tories as the party of workers, and this evening it's unelected peers that have defended workers. Now, Boris Johnson's people cock a hoop. They think that this provides lots of space for their man to come through the middle. I should point out that George Osborne's allies are saying whatever happens in a month, it is the case that by the end of this Parliament, tax credit system will be reformed in the way George Osborne would like, and so that will be his legacy in the fullness of time.
He had that omnishambles budget in 2012, isn't it?
Uber
omnishambles. What's another word for omni?
Indeed, difficult.
Duncan, just in the public finance terms, 4.4 billion between friends. Can he lose that, or?
Well, you mentioned the omnishambles budget, and he reversed on what was called the pasty tax then, but that really was small change compared to £4.5 billion. Of course, the fundamental problem is the Chancellor has said tonight he's going to both continue to save money and also mitigate the impact, and it's quite hard to see how he's going to do that. Hopefully all will be revealed at the autumn statement at the end of November. Because if you are trying to take money out of welfare and you're protecting pensioners, you are going to create losers. Now, £4.5 billion, it won't be that whole £4.5 billion. We don't know how much the mitigation will be, but even if it was a complete U-turn, a complete reversal of that £4.5 billion, it sounds like a lot, but the Chancellor would still just get to his surplus at the end of this Parliament. He wouldn't hit it by very much, but he'd still, on the current numbers, just about hit it. And of course, as we know, economically, the difference between a small surplus and a small deficit politically might matter a lot, economically not huge.
It uses up his whole safety margin, basically. Duncan, Allegra, thanks very much. Well, there are two issues at play here: tax credit cuts and the right of the Lords to have their say on them or not. Our policy editor Chris Cook spent the day following the Lords debate.
George Osborne announced a big shift at the July budget. The rabbit in his red box was a rise in the national minimum wage, but it was offset by deep cuts to tax credits.
And as Alistair Darling has said, the sheer scale of tax credits is subsidising lower wages in a way that was never intended. So those who oppose any savings to tax credits will have to explain how on earth they propose to eliminate the deficit, let alone run a surplus and pay down debt.
Now, at the time, papers who had supported the Conservatives at the May election welcomed the move. None went quite as far as the Mail, it has to be said, which canonised the Chancellor into Saint George. That all seems quite a long time ago. That dragon now looks a bit big. The The tax credit cuts will take £4.4 billion from 3.3 million households, an average of over £1,300 a year. And the higher minimum wage won't close that gap. Now, disquiet about the tax credit proposals has been growing since they were first announced in the summer. And today they reached the House of Lords, which is just behind me, ironically, under that picture of St George and the Dragon. Now, the peers are considering 5 potential proposals today, ranging from outright acceptance of the plans through to outright rejection. There's a question, though, about how far the peers can actually go when dealing with a measure of this kind.
There are 2 reasons why there have been controversies about the constitutional position, which are both about the conventions governing what the House of Lords can do. One is that this was implemented by what's called a statutory instrument, which is a kind of small measure that goes through a much briefer parliamentary process than ordinary law. It's presented to both chambers on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. The House of Lords formally has a veto, but it normally doesn't use it. The second reason is that it was a financial measure, and the House of Lords by convention doesn't get too involved in financial measures. But actually on both of these things it's completely arguable, and we heard arguments on both sides about what's precedented, what's unprecedented, what's constitutional, what's unconstitutional, and it's very far from clear-cut.
In the event, most peers took the view that they could, after all, have a crack at this legislation. Baroness Hollis, a Labour peer, put down one amendment.
It instead delays this SI to ask the government to provide transitional protection for existing families who are doing everything we asked of them, who trusted the Prime Minister's word that tax credits would not be cut, and they trusted Parliament, us, my lords, when we said we would make work pay.
The Lords actually passed 2 of the proposed amendments, including Baroness Hollis's. They voted to withhold consent for the cuts until the government gave protection for a minimum of 3 years to families who now receive tax credits. It's certainly not comfortable for George Osborne being told by a group of unelected peers that you're out of touch. The big question is what he is going to do next. And his problem is there are just no easy fixes on tax credits.
He has various options such as cutting income tax or cutting national insurance, but tax credits were actually very well targeted on low-income families, generally with children who are in work. And so any change such as through the tax system would likely cost more money than the original tax credit saving and be less well targeted on the families in greatest need.
There's another issue here too. This is the first majority Tory government since Labour removed the Conservative hereditary rump from the House of Lords.
It's always defeated Labour governments, but now we're seeing it defeating a Conservative government for the first time, because this is the first Conservative majority government since that reform, and the party doesn't have a majority in the chamber. So it's now seeing a challenge. We now have a situation where the Lords can challenge a Conservative government from the left rather than a Labour government from the right, which is quite a change in British politics and rather uncomfortable for this government.
George Osborne said tonight he is listening on tax credits, but we don't know what he'll do. He says the vote has raised constitutional issues that must be addressed. We don't know what that means either. So it was a defeat for the government tonight for sure, but we just don't know what follows.
Chris Cook there. Well, tonight it was a motion proposed by Labour's Baroness Hollis that's forced the Chancellor to retreat. She's just come from her victory in the Lords and is with us now, and so too are 2 Tories of differing views about the predicament the government is in, the MP Jacob Rees-Mogg and Tim Montgomerie from the Times. Good evening to you all. Baroness Hollis, did you have any qualms at all about the constitutional propriety of what you were proposing?
No, because as a matter of finance, if government wishes, the House of Commons wishes to claim financial privilege, which they're entirely entitled to do, on, for example, an amendment to a bill, it can be overturned in the Commons and the Speaker may give no reason, simply say, we certify it as a money issue and that's that. So the government could have done that, included it, for example, in the Welfare Reform Bill, which is going through the House of Commons. It chose not to get the protection of financial privilege there. Secondly, the government could, if it had chosen, gone the other route of financial privilege and put it into a money or supply bill, a finance bill. It didn't do that either.
So you feel quite entitled then to have your go at it because of the way they did it?
Basically, government didn't seek or claim financial privilege. Then when it comes up, it says, actually, please assume that we wanted financial privilege. We didn't ask for it, but please give it to us any rate.
Right.
Well, against that are 3 million people facing cuts.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, I think you've suggested the government should create 100 peers. Before this vote, you said the government should create 100 peers to override the Lord's decision.
It is an extraordinary breach of the conventions and an attack on the House of Commons money privilege on £4.5 billion of expenditure. Since 1860, this is the third occasion on which the House of Lords has overturned the Commons on something relating to taxation or expenditure. In 1860, it was the Paper Duty Repeal Act. In 1909, it was the People's Budget, and now it's this. The argument on the Commons privilege on tax and expenditure long predates the creation of statutory instruments and the 1911 Parliament Act.
And why did the government not choose to do as Baroness Hollis suggests, introduce this as a financial measure
Because the House of Lords has never overturned a statutory instrument relating to money before. It's overturned a very small number. It's overturned 4 or 5 statutory instruments since 1968. Statutory instruments only come in 1946. It's very rare for the Lords to vote down a statutory instrument and unprecedented for the Lords to vote down one spending £4.5 billion.
But nonetheless, why did the government not do what it regularly does on social security bills that I handle and claim financial privilege? It does it all the time. It chose, Jacob, not to do it on this, and then afterwards says, oh, well, please treat it as though we did.
This is an attack on the House of Commons, not on the government. It is the House of Commons privilege, the democratic privilege to determine taxation and spending. It is a privilege inherent in the subject matter,
we've heard that argument,
not in the form.
I think we've heard that particular debate. Are you still proposing the government should create 100 peers? Is that your...
Well, I think
do you think it needs reform now? There's some sort of serious fight needs to be fought?
There is a serious problem if the House of Lords is going to overturn the conventions. Up until the removal of the hereditary peers, the Conservatives had an inbuilt majority in the House of Lords. But they observed the conventions by and large because they wanted to maintain the House of Lords. They were therefore careful about exercising theoretical powers. There is now a left-wing majority in the House of Lords, which in 6 months of a Conservative government being elected has overturned the most important convention, that taxation and expenditure is the prerogative of the House of Commons, and therefore the government will need to do something if it's to govern effectively till 2020.
Tim Montgomerie, is there an appetite in the Conservative Party right now to have a constitutional tussle with the House of Lords?
I don't think so. And I think if you have just a month ago, the last time I was in this studio, it was just after David Cameron had given his party conference speech in which he really relaunched the Conservative Party as a one-nation Conservative Party. To try and stuff the House of Lords with 100 peers to enact legislation that cuts the benefits of the working poor, that is a very difficult look for a party that's trying to present itself as blue-collar friendly. So it would be constitutionally difficult, but to do it for something that is so controversial, so opposite to where David Cameron says he wants to take the Conservative Party, I don't think there is a chance in any rational political sense that the Conservatives would do this.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
There is a but. I absolutely accept what Tim is saying, that this is not necessarily the most popular issue on which to create 100 peers. But if the Lords within 6 months are willing to overturn the conventions, the government is going to have further controversial business to introduce between now and 2020. If the Lords are going to break convention and overturn things that ought to go through smoothly, then the government will have to create more peers.
Should they be worried about the precedent?
No, because what government should do is if they want a financial privilege, they should claim it. But not after the event say, oh, well, we have this new convention that even though we didn't claim financial privilege, we want you to behave as though we did.
I think the other slightly awkward thing for the Conservative Party as well is that Lords generally respects manifesto commitments. Yeah. But unfortunately, this wasn't really in the manifesto. There was talk of welfare cuts, but certainly from my experience, people didn't think those welfare cuts would be targeting people in work. They had this slightly false, unrealistic image that it would be people out of work that would pay. So actually the government doesn't really even have the cover of a manifesto commitment to drive this through.
David Cameron, as you will know, made a public pledge twice that they would not cut tax credits to find their
Well,
way.
it was a little more ambiguous.
The unelected...
Last word, Jacob, and then I want to move on to tax credits.
The unelected House works properly when it obeys the conventions. If this is a sign of regular breaches of convention, and the Lib Dems have said they will not necessarily follow the Salisbury-Addison Convention, then the Lords will need to have many more peers to make sure the government can get its business through.
The argument is whether the convention has been followed or not. Now, what is the government going to do about this? George Osborne has said there will be something in the autumn statement. What would satisfy you?
What I would like to see as a sensible way forward is to ensure that the cuts affect only new claimants. Not existing families, families who've done everything we asked for, have built their family life around both their wage and the, if you like, the income support that tax credits give if they have children and so on in addition. And those families need this money. I mean, I've been reading letters and emails from people saying, I'm terrified when that Christmas letter comes with the notification I'm going to lose £3,000 on a low income.
So,
I'm terrified.
New rules on new claimants, and for 3 years the old rules apply to the old claimants. Basically.
Exactly.
Right. Tim, is this one of those retreats that is ultimately going to benefit the government? Because it was turning out to be an enormous political headache. It was going to come back to the Commons. Some said there might even be issues there again. And actually now he's got a chance to deal with it, hasn't he?
I think there is a slight difference of interest between, say, George Osborne and the Conservative Party here. I think it probably has hurt George Osborne's authority. No Chancellor likes to make a U-turn, especially when you're talked of as a potential future leader. But this could have been very difficult for the Conservative Party. I think there was evidence that 71 constituencies, the 71 most marginal Tory MPs, the people affected, the number of people affected were greater than the majorities. This could have been a nagging sore for the Conservative Party. And of course you have to cut the deficit. But when you are at the same time cutting inheritance tax for people who are quite wealthy, when we have evidence from the Institute for Fiscal Studies saying that pensioners are now better off than the average citizen, but they're getting a 2.5% increase in their pension when inflation is falling, to make these kinds of cuts to the working poor when the Conservative Party is presenting itself, and one of its great successes in the last Parliament was creating so many jobs, it was a very, very bad position for the Conservative Party to be in. And they're saved from that now.
On the substantive issue, Jacob Rees-Mogg, was the only thing worse than the U-turn actually doing the original plan?
It's very difficult. The Chancellor had £4.5 billion worth of savings lined up from a budget that had gone from £1 billion to nearly £30 billion. So it was a very expensive programme. We know that cuts need to be made to make the books balance. Chancellors have to make difficult decisions. And I think Conservatives who will the end sometimes have to support Chancellors with the means when they are difficult. Not all decisions in government are easy, and bold Chancellors, good Chancellors, take difficult decisions and stick to the thrust of them.
But targeting the working poor, was that really what we came into politics to do, Jacob?
The government has made it clear that the package as a whole will ensure that people benefit, as you know, the increase in the living wage.
That's not true.
There's no independent
That's not true. The IRS denies that.
I happen to trust the government. You may think I'm naive, but when the Chancellor of the Exchequer says that the overall package will ensure that 9 out of 10 people are at least as well off, I think that is something.
That's you and I. His 8 out of 10 is you and I.
No, this is people getting tax credits. It's not.
It isn't.
And they will benefit from the...
I don't think you're right factually on that particular.
No,
I think it's the overall
labour.
labour.
9 out of 10 would be better off, and that the benefits to help people with children, nursery education and so on. So I think you do have to look at the overall package, and Chancellors do have to make difficult decisions, and we do have to balance the books.
It does leave one final question for you, Tim. What did you think you were doing in the election campaign, supporting £12 billion of welfare cuts? Unspecified welfare. Where did you think they were going to come from if they weren't going to come from tax credits?
Well, of course, let you into a little secret. The Conservatives didn't expect to win the general election. A lot of promises were made that they thought would be traded away in coalition negotiations. Things like the right to buy for housing associations, things like these 12 billion cuts. The Tories never expected to have to make them. And, of course, they're now discovering the difficulty of trying to.
We'll leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
I've been getting away with it all